Joseph Stiglitz is here. He is the winner of the 2001 Nobel Prize in Economics. During the Clinton administration, he was a member and then chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. From 1997 to the year 2000, he was senior vice president and chief economist of the World Bank. His new book is called The Roaring '90s. I am pleased to have him back at this table. Welcome back.
Nice to be here.
Before I talk about this, now, what is your, and we've talked about this sort of before, but just to, what is your criticism of the World Bank and the IMF and all that they were doing?
Well, the major criticism of the World Bank and the IMF was that in many ways they were pursuing policies, pushing developing countries to have policies that were very different from the policies that we were working for or supported at home. I mean, for instance, privatization of Social Security.
Right. Things that they neither had the institutions nor other kinds of resources to absorb.
Well, and they weren't the right policies. Okay. They weren't the right policies. And in the end, some of the things were like capital market liberalization, where you open up your markets to speculative capital flows, and the money rushes in, and you get a little bit of a boom, and then the money rushes out, and you have a severe depression. That's the kind of policy that they pushed that the countries were not ready for. We can have that kind of open capital market without that danger.
But is it primarily what we call third world countries that we're talking about here? Right. We're not talking about Russia, or we're not talking about...
Well, I actually had a severe criticism of what they did in Russia. The argument there was that we used shock therapy to get them from moving from communism to a market economy, and that was likely to fail, and it failed.
What did Jeffrey Sachs have to do with that?
Well, he was one of a school of thought who advocated shock therapy. Right. But there were a variety of forms of shock therapy. One of the forms of shock therapy was getting macro inflation, the excessive inflation that came right after the movement, getting that down. And there's a second part that had to do with mass privatization.
Right.
And trying to liberalization, changing the whole structure of the economy overnight. You had to get inflation down, but you can't change societies in a period of 1 or 2 years.
Most of them now, whoever was either advocating or executing shock therapy, recognize that it was the wrong policy at the wrong time?
I think most do, but a lot have a vested interest, and they will say they didn't follow the doctor's orders completely. Yeah. You know, it was sort of like the Middle Ages, where you were letting blood out of somebody, and you stop while he still had some blood of that.
It reminds me of communists who say there was nothing wrong with the ideology, we just didn't do it well.
That's right. It's always implementation.
Yes. All right, let me turn from that. We'll maybe come back to it, to the Roaring '90s. A new history of the world's most prosperous decade. Tell me what happened in the '90s that made it successful, because you have people in the Bush administration now who you are sharply critical of because of what's happening specifically in terms of deficits and your disagreement over tax policy, who will say that the Clinton economic policies were in decline near the end of his administration.
Well,
and that's what the Bush administration woke up to.
Well, every administration inherits a set of problems, and the real test of an administration is what you do with those. So, for instance, Clinton inherited an economy that was weak, in recession, inherited huge fiscal deficits, trade deficits, and growing inequality. And
growing inequality between rich and poor.
Poor, that's right. And
within America.
Within America, within America. And what the Clinton administration managed to do was to do something about a couple of those problems, some very big ones. I mean, for instance, got the deficit down and turned it into a surplus. It got the economy.
How did it do that?
Well, that was a very tough set of actions that it took, raising taxes and cutting expenditures. It was a mix of the two. And one of the stories I tell in the book is to re-examine the story of how the link between deficit reduction, falling interest rates, and the economic recovery. And one of the things I try to do in the book is to try to explain that some of the standard story that we give is wrong.
Yes.
The standard story was that it was only with deficit reduction that we could get interest rates lower, and that was necessary to stimulate investment.
Lower interest rates were necessary to stimulate investment.
That's right.
And so you're saying what?
Well, if the Fed had wanted to lower interest rates, it could have. There is nothing in economic theory or economic history that says that the Fed can only lower interest rates when the deficit is small.
All right.
I think it was a good thing to lower the deficit, but that is not the central piece of the recovery.
Okay, if they had lowered the interest rates, the Fed had,
that would have led to
and had not attacked the deficit, increasing revenues, would the recovery, would the success of the Clinton years in terms of economic growth been the same?
Well, there would have been growth, there would have been recovery, but to maintain the economy from having inflation, you would not have been able to lower the interest rates quite as much, and you probably would not have had quite as much investment.
Right.
And the growth would have been somewhat more dampened. But the underlying force in the 90s was our technology boom.
Yeah.
And that would have happened anyway. And in fact, one might have argued that we would not have had some of the excesses. And one of the points of this book is to argue that we pushed a number of things too far in the 90s. We pushed deregulation too far. We cut capital gains taxes. Yeah. So right in the period in which you're having this...
Why is that a bad idea?
Well, there are a number of issues, but one of them is it was the timing couldn't have been worse, because you have this economy in which the stock market is going off in a bubble. And then you cut capital gains taxes, and it's like feeding the frenzy. Everybody starts saying, we want to get on this game. What it meant was that during the Clinton years, we lowered taxes on those who were speculating in stock markets, and we raised taxes on upper middle income people who were working. That didn't make a lot of sense from a point of view of general,
Well, you were there.
Well, I tried to stop it.
That's one of the things. You were outvoted in terms of influence on the president.
That's right.
But let me just.
But it was also it was a Congress. It was a question of what you could get through Congress, a conservative Congress that wanted a tax cut, and unfortunately was resolved. This was a tax cut that seemingly paid for itself, because by lowering the capital gains tax, you had like a sale on speculative gains. And that seemed to generate more revenue in the short run, and you didn't think about the long-run consequences.
I want to go so many directions here. Let me just stay with your notion that the technology boom drove the economy during the Clinton years, because it began 94, somewhere right in that time. Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
And then you had the development of the internet, and you had all the other kinds of things that were happening, and you saw Intel and Microsoft and all those great companies that did so well during that period. Then you had the bubble burst, because the Bush administration will say, look what the Clinton administration gave us. The technology boom collapsed, and it's not our fault, so don't attack us. So
well, as I said, every administration begins with an inheritance.
Yeah, but I want you to tell me what is.
And let me. So what the problem was that they began with a weakening economy, a weakening stock market, but with a huge surplus.
Right.
And they could have used that surplus to have tax cuts designed to stimulate the economy.
And what kind of tax cuts would that be?
Well, for instance, one of the things they could have done would have been to provide stronger unemployment benefits. We have one of the weakest unemployment systems of any of the advanced industrial countries.
In terms of meaning that we do less for people unemployed.
Exactly. Shorter smaller percentage of replacement.
Right.
And these people, if you give them the money, they spend it, because their money.
That's obvious.
If you give a tax cut for lower income individuals, those are people who are in the really struggling to get along.
Yeah.
You give them that tax cut, they spend it, and it really goes into the economy right away. You give tax cuts not just for corporations in general, but targeted to those doing new investment, and it was called investment tax credit. Right.
And
that's what Kennedy...
So they'll build new plants and things like that, and that'll create jobs and everything else.
Exactly. So you target it. A fourth thing that I had recommended back at that point was state and localities were going to be facing a problem.
Right.
And I saw that coming in 2001.
And boy, has that been true.
True. And you could just see it, and you know it historically. As the economy goes down, tax revenues in the states and localities go down.
Why is that? What happened to make, I mean, how many states in America, of the 50 states, how many are operating at a deficit?
Oh, I think most of them.
That's what I think so.
And the amounts.
I think somebody once said 40 out of 50 or something like that. Some extraordinary
and it's a significant amount of money. Yeah. And most of the states, almost all the states in the United States, have what we call balanced budget amendment frameworks, so that when their revenues go down, they either have to cut back expenditures or raise taxes.
Well, the city of New York has the same thing.
Exactly. And now, when that happens, that's a dampening. So what you have is you have the government, you have the federal government cutting taxes. Yeah. And state governments raising taxes.
Yeah. And the federal government also is pushing more of social services onto states and localities.
Exactly.
So, as a product, welfare reform, and a lot of other things.
So you have more pressure on them to provide services and less resources. Yeah. But from a point of view of the overall performance of the economy, which is what we were talking about, as they cut back expenditures because they have no revenue and raise taxes, that dampens the economy significantly. So had they done those four things that I just described,
the Bush administration,
if the Bush administration,
when they came in and they had all this surplus, if they had chosen different policies,
the economy would have recovered, and we would be much stronger now. We've lost 2.7 million jobs. You know, it's sort of. Yeah. Ironic.
Unemployment's up at about 6 or 7%.
That's right, and remember, we have to create about 1 million jobs a year for the new entrants in the labor force. Yeah. So we're not creating the jobs for the new people coming in. My students are all having trouble finding jobs. Right. So we're not creating the new jobs, and we're actually losing almost 1 million jobs a year. It's the worst job performance in many ways since the Great Depression, since Herbert Hoover. And it's all unnecessary. It was all unnecessary. So yes, he inherited a problem. Right. And many presidents inherited a problem. Clinton inherited a problem. And the issue is what you do with it.
All right. And so just for what else should we say about the roaring? And before we talk about the future, what else should we say about the 90s? I mean, you've got a whole book here.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two other themes that we did sow some of the seeds of the destruction while we were in there. We, for instance,
we being the Clinton administration.
The Clinton administration. I mean, I think one has to look at what you do so you can learn the lessons, so the next time you don't repeat them. And we had some intense battles over these issues, like accounting. Right. We recognized we had a debate in '93, '94 about CEO. Stock options and how they should be reported, and I, as an information economist, was very worried that if you didn't report it in ways that people understood it, it would be giving effectively bad information. With bad information, you have prices that don't reflect accurately what's going on. Prices are important because they make the market work. They give the signal for investment, and then you have misallocation of investment. And then you have what we had in the 90s. So you have huge amounts of resources effectively wasted. So we had an opportunity, we had a debate, and yet some of the special interests, the financial interests, said if we report that information, the stock prices will go down. And my view is that yes, exactly right. Yeah. If people knew what was really going on, better to do it.
And if you believe in the market, that's okay.
Better to do it now than let the bubble go up.
Exactly.
And then,
but let me talk for a minute about the bubble going up. I mean, the bubble went up because of two. It seems to me, and you tell me, you're the Nobel laureate, but for two reasons. Number one, a huge overcapacity caused the bubble to burst. All of a sudden they built up everything and there was no demand for it, and you spent all this money, you had all this debt, and you were in trouble. Secondly, because there was no reality, as you were pointing, in terms of basic law of supply and demand and the basic law of you've got to be earning money in order to stay in business. When they weren't having any earnings, they were just living off of money that people had given them in IPOs, and once that ran out, they had nowhere to go because they didn't have a revenue stream that would keep them alive.
Yeah, and one of my main themes here is how the market economy conveys information, how the information that you need to make sure you don't get these imbalances that you describe get out there. And the problem is that we have normally a set of checks and balances, and for a variety of reasons that I described, those got out of line. So the accountants are supposed to be one of the mechanisms to make sure that you get accurate information.
Yeah. And they failed.
They failed. They had a conflict of interest. We knew they had a conflict of interest, and it was just very hard for Arthur Levitt to get through the kinds of changes that you needed. You had banks that were, the analysts made more money touting the stocks that their investment banks
were underwriting
then, and it was all here and now, bottom line. We might lose our reputation, but so what? We're making the money today. And
it was extraordinary. When you look at the email of some of the correspondence that went on,
they knew what they were doing.
That they were touting stuff that was no good.
But
in some cases.
And the stock option mentality is what influenced this whole thing. Everybody could get rich quickly. And what I try to explain in the book is how that and how like the IPOs were effectively forms of theft from the shareholders. That what was going on here were the CEOs and the top executives and the investment banks and the accountants were I don't want to say in a collusive, but effectively acting like that. And who paid the price? The shareholders.
Sure.
And that was because
but they paid a severe price, not just in a depreciation of stock, but all of a sudden their pension fund and everything else.
And then what I try to emphasize here is that was also linked to why the economy didn't function well. Why that bad information led to bad decisions about how our scarce resources get used.
Right.
And that led to the overcapacity.
Right.
And eventually, like every time this happens, the information eventually gets out. You can't hide it. It was distorted information. Eventually got out, and that's when things collapsed.
Okay, that brings us up to where we are now. On balance, was Clinton smart about economics?
Yes.
He was?
Yes.
He got it?
I think he got it.
He also had to put it in a political dimension because he obviously is a politician, and if you can't get reelected, you won't be a statesman ever.
That's right. I mean, I think that there were a couple of mistakes. I think he three things that I would mention. One is I think that they did push this deregulation mantra too far, and the issue would have been what was the right regulatory framework, not deregulation, including accounting as an example. The second thing is that I think they pushed deficit reduction too far.
Do you really? I know you think that, actually.
Yes.
But why?
Well, because
the Bush people are going to be thrilled to hear you say this.
Well, they've done it the other way. I mean, I'm trying to get the right balance here. The numbers that we use for deficit are only one part of a balance sheet.
Right.
It's what you're borrowing. But what's also important is what you're investing. Any firm will find it perfectly reasonable to borrow if it's investing in...
If it's using the funds wisely.
Wisely. So the problem was that we were so focused on deficit reduction that we didn't invest, for instance, enough in science and technology. Here...
Well, see, I would have thought Clinton would have gotten that. I mean, that was something
he got that. But his political agenda that you mentioned, trying to get it through a Republican Congress,
especially after '94,
tied his hands. So I, this is not a faulting of. It was the political context that everybody was focusing on the time on deficit reduction.
Okay, but in saying that, you are in fact saying, just make sure we understand this. I mean that for all those people who say deficits per se are an awful thing, you are stepping forward and saying not necessary.
It depends on how you spend the money.
A lot of people borrow money and use it well and increase growth and create jobs and do a whole lot of other things.
And in fact, if we underinvest in R&D, we're not going to, our strength came, as I said, in the 90s from technology.
And most people can't live off of cash flow. And I mean, most corporations.
And they borrow and they invest. So the real problem is not in the 90s, we were focusing excessively on deficit reduction, and that inhibited our investment. The problem today is our deficits are caused not because we've decided we want to spend more in R&D. Right. We've given a tax cut for some very, very well-off people.
Now, help me understand that. I mean, because that's what all the Democrats are saying. The tax cuts that were passed, recommended by the Bush administration, most of them went to the wealthy? Because you've got people that are saying, you know, you've got John Kerry and I think John Edwards and some others are saying, don't roll them all back because some of them were good.
Well, in the end,
those for the middle class were good.
In the end, in the political compromise in the Senate,
right,
there were these are not tax cuts that Bush proposed, but the Democrats insisted, and moderate Republicans also agreed that you couldn't have as unfair a tax cut as Bush had originally proposed.
Right.
His original proposal it was unbelievable. To take one provision of it, like the dividend tax cut, right. A couple 100,000 people at the top would have gotten the same benefit, those limited number, as about 100 million people at the bottom. Mm-hmm. We've never had a tax cut that is that unfair. But so what happened is that to get it through Congress, there was a compromise.
Yeah.
And
to get Democrat votes, they had to...
And some moderate Republicans, because some moderate Republicans agreed that this was outrageous.
Right.
And so you put in some provisions for middle-class tax cuts. And I think there's a sense that may be appropriate. But more than half of the tax cuts went to the very, very wealthy, who had already...
More than half? More than half? More than half in what way? More than half of the...
Of the total, if you look at what happens to the revenues coming into the government. Right. They've gone down.
In other words, if you say, look, we're going to bring in $100 in revenue, you know, and
then we reduce it. We're going to have a tax cut. We're going to reduce it. So, where are the tax savings going?
Right.
Who is not paying?
And you're saying under the Bush proposal, 50% of it?
More than that, coming from...
Went to people who make more than $100,000.
Yeah, who are doing very... I don't know exact numbers, but who are doing very, very well. And you have to put that in context of the fact that during the 90s and the previous 2 decades, those upper income people have done very well. And right now, the real thing is that the inequality that we finally start, I mentioned that from 73 to 93, inequality was increasing. We then finally started to get that turned around, and the inequality between the rich and the poor started to decrease.
Right.
It's increasing again. So the people who are already doing well are getting the bigger benefits.
Okay. Is the economy getting better?
Well, we mentioned before that there were these tax cuts, some of which went to middle-class Americans and poor Americans. Those are providing some stimulus. It wasn't part of Bush's. Bush shouldn't get credit for this. This was the Democrats and people
this was part of the compromise that took place in the Congress.
That's right. That's providing some stimulus. The military...
Because those people are taking that tax cut, money they get back from the government, say...
And spending it.
And spending it.
And spending it. And that's giving a boost to the economy.
They didn't have to send to the government.
Yeah. And the expenditures that we're spending, increased expenditure in military, is stimulating the economy. It's not a robust recovery.
So do you say to me that if, in fact, all the tax cut had been for the middle class and the poor, that we'd have a much better economy?
Much better economy.
Why did the Bush administration and other administrations argue that it can't work that way? You have to give some of the tax cuts to the wealthy because they're the ones who pay all the taxes.
Well, some may be, the issue is proportions.
Right.
It's balance. And if we had directed more towards those who have not done as well in the last 35 years,
right,
more towards lower middle-income Americans, we would have gotten a much stronger stimulus, and our economy today would be much stronger than...
Can you argue that the rich, whoever they are, whatever the standard is for measuring, I don't know what it is,
100,000 or 150, it keeps going up because they're doing better and better.
Statistically, can you argue that they don't invest their tax savings into as much as the poor do or as much as the middle class do?
Well, I mean, I think the way to ask it is the following.
Yes,
1993, Clinton did raise taxes
Right.
on the upper 2%, just the upper 2%,
Right.
because it was part of the deficit reduction
Right.
strategy.
Also part of his political calculus.
Yeah, and you asked the question, did that have any adverse effect?
Yeah.
No.
No.
People.
So
in
you
fact,
can tax the rich and it has no adverse effect.
It did not have any
can tax
adverse
the rich
effect.
and it has no adverse effect.
You know, if we had done it
Except-
excessively.
Yeah, because I mean they're not large in numbers, so therefore they can't vote you out of office.
And their pay was strong enough that
Yeah.
they continue to work. They have
Right.
incentive to
Right.
work. Their incentive for savings is high.
Okay.
They continue to save.
So you come down. If you look at where we ought to be going, is we ought to be tax cuts for the middle class and the poor, and raise taxes on the rich.
I think that's what economic analysis would say. I mean, when
Is
you
that
say
what
raise,
Keynes would say?
Raise, at least go back to where we were.
All right.
You know, it's the question of where we were and how much more unequal we've made things.
But do you paint a picture that if we don't change the policies here, we're going to bankrupt the country, or we're going to destroy Medicare, or we're going to destroy
Very
some
much. Our
essential-
long-run prospects, we are going to have a real problem. One of the issues is with these deficits, we aren't going to be able to fund a whole host of programs.
Because first of all, on the demand side, there can be a whole lot more people in need of them.
Exactly.
Your obligation to a whole lot more people than you're obligated to now. And on the other side, there's not going to be enough money to give to them.
Exactly. And our deficits are getting larger and larger. And the total debt, national debt, will be soaring.
So the Bush administration would say to you, my dear Nobel laureate, that's what they would say. We are creating economic growth, and economic growth and a good economy will take care of these deficits. Now stop worrying.
And that's precisely what Reagan and the first Bush
Right.
administration said, and it didn't work. They said we were going to grow our way out of the deficit.
You just didn't have enough time, they would say.
12 years. And
You mean 8 Reagan, 4 Bush?
4 Bush. And if you looked at the projections, at the end of the second Bush administration, at the end of the Bush administration, after 12 years, the deficit was close to 5% of GDP. No evidence that it was going to get that much better. So there is no plausible case that we will grow ourselves out of this
so
problem.
we're going to be in deep trouble soon, by the year 2010 or something, unless we do what?
Well, unless we address these fundamental problems. And particularly, we have to raise taxes.
A growing deficit.
We have a growing deficit, and we also have a growing trade deficit.
Right.
And those two are not unrelated. It's called the twin deficit problem. Typically, when you increase or have a high fiscal deficit, government revenues are less than expenditures, you have to borrow abroad.
Right.
And that is associated with a trade deficit. And that's what we have again. We're borrowing $1.5 billion a day. Here we have the richest country in the world,
Yeah.
and we can't live within our means. And that's because the government is pursuing an irresponsible policy.
Okay, what ought to be our trade policy?
Well,
In other words, are we helped, or there's a rising cry, and I won't overhype this, but there are more Democrats now seem to be saying protectionism is not all that bad.
and the fundamental problem
Whereas
is...
Clinton was exactly the opposite.
Opposite.
Clinton was
And
saying
Clinton-
NAFTA good.
Well, two comments, and I discuss some of these issues in the book. The first is that after the end of the Cold War, we had an opportunity, an obligation, I would say, to try to help create a new global economic order based on principles of social justice, the kind of values that
We're talking about 92 when Clinton came
93,
in.
93,
Yeah, right.
and we missed that opportunity. We let parochial special interests try to dictate, and we got a set of agreements that were ostensibly good for us in the short run,
Right.
but not in the long run, because we engender so much hostility around the world that we're now having trouble going further in this,
How do we engender hostility?
because the agreement was so unfair, so unbalanced.
Okay. Yeah.
We were better off
Right.
But the poorest region in the world, sub-Saharan Africa, was actually worse off. It wasn't just that we got the lion's share of the gain. They were actually worse off. It was asymmetries.
Right, asymmetrical, right?
We insisted they open up their markets to our goods, that they get rid of their subsidies, and we didn't reciprocate. And we used our economic muscle, and we got away with it at the time. But now they're saying no more.
Yeah. Is that part of the reason beyond, a whole host of other things that we talk about on this program all the time, that America's is not such great favor around the world now?
That's right. It's one of the reasons that we really didn't, and that's one of the mistakes I think that we made in the 90s. But the other point I wanted to make was that the underlying reason, as I said, for our trade deficit, which is causing so much problem, is our fiscal deficit.
Right.
That it's inevitable that if we borrow, if we can't live within our own means, we have to borrow from abroad.
Right.
And whenever you have you're borrowing like that, you have a trade deficit. It's just the two are just two sides of the same coin.
Okay, but I mean,
and therefore, you're going to be importing more than you're exporting.
Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, no, and so don't blame the foreigners. Blame our fiscal policy. Blame the Bush administration.
But is Clinton going to be happy about this book?
I think he should.
You think he should?
I think he should, because life is difficult. He had an enormous number of constraints. He had political constraints, particularly after '94 with the Republican Congress.
Well, but also, I mean, the health care plan went awry, and that hurt him.
That's right. But I commented in the beginning of the book that I'm a hard grader.
Yeah. So
that I grade, but in the end, I grade on the curve. I was in a peculiar position, being both an academic
and also an insider,
and being an insider. So my view in this was very much I ought to write a book that reflects my role as an academic, which is being a hard grader.
Yeah.
But I grade on the curve, and I look at what happened before, and I look at what happened after, and I have to say, he has to get high marks.
All right, and the jury's out on the Bush administration. We'll have to see, right?
I think that we've already seen 3 years of enormous job losses, the largest bankruptcies, huge trade deficits.
But
the breakdown
did the Bush administration create the bankruptcies?
Yes, because it didn't manage the economic downturn well. If it had managed the economic downturn better, in the way I described in 2001, then you're not talking
about Enron or WorldCom or those companies. You're talking about, I mean, who are all these companies that went bankrupt?
Oh, well, as the economy went down, one after many companies, the bankruptcy rate.
Yeah, but a lot of that wasn't a lot of that a product of the bubble,
some of that was.
The dot-com bubble bursting.
Some of that was.
Which was based on faulty economics from the beginning.
Yeah, some of that was. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about that. But there's absolutely no doubt that when you have a weaker economy, no matter what, what other faults you are, the weaker the economy, the more firms that are going to go bankrupt.
You make it interesting. To Anya again. Who is Anya?
Anya. She's the person I live with, and my book Globalization and Discontents. She was the one who worked with me on doing Globalization and Discontents, which focuses on the international issues.
You won the Nobel Prize for what?
Well, economics of information.
Yeah, I know, but what does that mean?
Well, it recognizes that people have imperfect information in the economy, and there's a disparity between information. Like some people know more than others. And most of economic theory for the preceding hundreds of years had assumed that there was perfect information. Not that everybody really believed that there was perfect information, but they hoped that a world with perfect information, with imperfect information, would be like a world with imperfect information. And I showed that that was not true.
The Roaring '90s, Joseph Stiglitz, winner of the Nobel Prize. He was inside. He is an academic. He was at the World Bank. Read this and it'll help you understand some of the things that went on and why we are where we are now, for better or for worse. Thank you.